Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we are continuing in our discussion of the Daodejing, and today we are on chapter 29. So with that, let me go ahead and get started here with the text. Starts off, and today we're going to do with the Feng and English translation, the second one that we normally use.
No, okay.
And it starts off by saying, do you think you can conquer the universe and improve it? And the word that's getting translated, or the phrase that's getting translated as universe here is, and again, forgive my pronunciation, but it's Tianzia, which is basically saying everything under heaven, which is usually a way of referencing the planet, or more specifically like the realm or of human activity. So we could talk about it as like the world, in more of a general sense. It can also end up meaning more specifically like the empire, and in particular reference to empire. But I think the way this chapter kind of unfolds, it might be a broader application than simply, trying to conquer and improve the empire, but it might be more broadly applicable to the world as we understand it in that sense. So an interesting thing, because we talk about this, or this kind of thing comes up a lot in the sense of, trying to make the world a better place. How do we improve it? Well, the next statement here says, I don't believe this can be done. So there's ways that we need to think about this. Well, I shouldn't say need to think about it, but a couple of different angles that I think might help explain why he might be saying something like this. Because I can think of several areas in our world that seem to be much better, improved, that would seem to kind of call this into question. But it really depends on how we're talking, like how do we measure improvement, and then also what kind of boundaries are we putting on in terms of thinking about it. So we have some very short scale boundaries that we could put on something, where, let's say, I figure out how to make a more comfortable seat for the car on my ride into work or something like that. So you could say, okay, yeah, I've improved, the quality of my life for this drive into work. So here I've done something where I've improved it. But if we stretch this out a little bit further in terms of the scope that we think about it, there's other questions that can start to come into play. So when we're thinking about vehicles, when we're thinking about factories and things that are required to make things like car seats, there's definitely a cost that comes with that. And there may be something that we look at as an improvement at kind of a personal experience level that could be something that's much more devastating at a larger level. So there would be one way we need to think about this in terms of where do we draw the boundaries to define what we mean by improve, and then also, in terms of like long lasting. So maybe I've made this car seat and it works great for me, but in 500 years, does anybody care? Maybe they're not even using cars at that point, right? So there's a duration as well as scope that we can think about the question. And then along those same lines, we could even zoom it out much further. In the total history of the planet, the 4.5 billion years or whatever it is, will the things that we do right now be significant in that scheme of things? Or if we zoom it out even further in terms of the scope of the universe itself, does anything that actually happens on this planet make any difference? So those are some different ways we could look at trying to answer this question or try to interpret his answer to this question, which is, I don't believe this can be done. And I think where he's coming with this has more to do with the short-sighted versus long-sighted approach. So, am I only concerned about how I've improved my personal ride to work with my car seat, or am I concerned about the larger environmental impact of people driving cars and having factories to make things like car seats? I think that might be a little bit more along the lines of where he's thinking of it. And maybe I'll pause for a second to see if either of you want to jump in on something like this.
I think every little thing counts. So, like if you're going on a long walk to get to your destination, every step that you take may be small, but it counts towards getting there. So, I think if you think about zooming in and zooming out and the things that you're doing, I think even if they're small, you can still have an impact.
So if you're thinking about going on a journey somewhere, you have a goal that you're trying to achieve, you're trying to get somewhere. And certainly each of those steps is a requirement for the ultimate goal, right? So the small pieces make up the bigger thing. But the question wasn't not about can we have goals, but can we improve the world?
Yeah, I think so. I think my point is like, I think you can improve it even if you're zooming in and zooming out on the things that you're doing and they seem small.
Mhm.
I think no matter how small, if you're doing things that matter, then they count.
So how do you, what would be an example of something along those lines that you think?
Hmm. Not being judgmental, maybe?
Mm. So ways that we could improve the social world in terms of how we engage with it, in terms of our perceptions.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting take on this too, because certainly the world in terms of all under heaven in this Taoist sense can definitely imply the social world. Excuse me. So it's interesting to think about where's he coming from with this, because obviously the Taoists have this idea that they have, well, an agenda for how to do things in more harmony, right? That's going to be more balanced. So they think there's a way to engage in that social world in a way that's more beneficial in that sense. Um, so maybe where they're getting into is more of the idea of trying to engineer something contrary to that natural way. So in the way that you were talking about our perceptions and modifying those, do you think that that perception was trying to get more towards the actual nature of things, and that's why it would be a benefit?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so that becomes kind of this interesting challenge then in the Taoist, at least in the Daodejing here, this classical Taoist concept that I'm wrestling with in this book here. I think in some sense, if they're addressing the context of the Warring States period and they're trying to figure out how do we get out of this mess, it can be looked at in terms of, improving, like going from chaos to not being in chaos. But they might be looking at that in the sense of how we're getting back to not chaos is by a return to more of a natural state, that what brought about the chaos was trying to impose in a natural state. This
Right.
Right, so there was like this initial attempt to improve on something by taking the natural human diversity and trying to get everybody to conform to a particular way of being in order to facilitate this larger organization of empire in order for it to function. That would be, I think, along the lines where they're saying, that tweaking with the social dynamics in order to bring about this improved idea of large social engineering, let's say, to bring about something like an empire was the thing that brought the chaos, and that the way to restore it is going back to more of the natural. And so that would be kind of the difference between the improved versus going with what would normally happen, the normal flow of things under heaven. Yeah, lots of interesting ways that could be looked at. There's a lyric that came to mind from a song when I was reflecting on this that I'm going to share. The gal's name is, or performance name is Anami Bell, and the song is called Machine. And it is actually a really fascinating song if you get a chance to hear the whole thing. But part of the chorus says this: "And I have done unconscionable things in pursuit of dreams fed to me on the screen. And how is my life so much more precious than anybody else?" And that really got me thinking about a lot of the issues we think about improvement or the motivation for things, because often it's about pursuing personal comforts or desires, or something that's personal, like a loved one, or family members. When we think about the costs that can sometimes come into play for how we pursue these certain goals that we might think of in terms of improvement, but they might actually have devastating consequences otherwise. A movie that I saw, or a miniseries not too long ago, I think it was called what was it called? The Last of Us, is that right? The HBO series that they did.
Oh yeah, it's based
Yeah.
off of a game.
Yeah. And there was a couple of scenes in that, and this will be a spoiler, so you'll have to skip this spot if you're interested in watching that. But there's one scene where there's this enmity between two different kind of human survival groups with each other, because somebody went to extreme lengths to try and save their son, and in order to do that, I believe they had to kill somebody else. And to the father, it's like, it's my son, I can't do anything less, even though it meant killing somebody else's, in this case I think it was brother, that started like this whole war that then caused a whole bunch of people to get killed. And you think, where is that line in terms of, is even something like my son have a value that exceeds what could happen if it's actually going to cause like this whole battle? Or I think sometimes with the medical technology we have is tremendous, and it's fascinating, it's practically miraculous, but we also have to think about the cost to be able to actually have that kind of technology, and what kind of impact that has on the whole of the world, and who has access and who doesn't, and all the other questions. And I'm not saying I have the answers to that, but it brings up these interesting questions about kind of this line here, how is my life so much more precious than anybody else? And that is something that I think is really getting to the core of where the Taoists are approaching a lot of this. Is they've taken it out of the question of simply the human realm of interaction and expanded it out to the larger entire like ecosystem of everything. How do all these fit together, and where do the humans fit within this thing? And it's been something that's a bit more of a dehumanizing in terms of being human centric way of looking at the world. And certainly when we're considering like the social arrangements that they're critical of, this idea of justifying things like wars or other types of chaos that may pursue as a result of people viewing other people as more or less valuable and justifying the actions they make, I think really kind of ties into a lot of what's happening with this question prior of oops, where am I? Do you think you can improve it? And him saying, I don't believe this can be done. Interesting to me anyway, ways to kind of really ponder that. Continuing, then he says, the universe is sacred. Now, in this translation, it just has sacred, but in the actual Chinese behind this, it's I think it's actually called sacred vessel. So if, and again, universe here again is everything under heaven. So you could look at this idea of either the world being a sacred vessel, or I think the idea is getting at almost more of a superstitious aspect, where there were sacred things within different types of religious contexts that you wouldn't mess with, because there was a concern about retribution, that it's like you don't mess with these things because you might cause the spirits to get engaged in some kind of way and whatnot.
Jim, I was just going to interject one question there.
Yeah.
Would their understanding of the universe be comparable to the more ancient understanding, of it being a flat Earth and it's on stilts, and there's a dome over it, that type of thing? Would that same worldview be in accord here?
Not 100% sure. I haven't come across as much information about how they actually viewed the universe at this point in their history. Not that they maybe didn't speculate about it, but I just haven't come across it, so I can't answer that one.
Okay, that'd be a good question to ask, though.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because they seem to have a lot less concern about things like the origin of it and whatnot, much more questions about how do we participate in it. And it doesn't seem to get into a lot of questions about what's going on out there, like beyond our ability to observe. But I'm sure there was somewhere somebody was speculating about such things. But yeah, so here, the rest of the Daodejing doesn't seem to take any of this kind of like idea of really anything kind of supernatural into play in terms of thinking about divine retribution for messing with the sacred vessels or whatever they might be using in terms of some type of religious thing. But I think it's picking up on or making a play on this more kind of like popular level thinking about you don't mess with this, right? Because there could be implications. This is something that's considered set apart, which is really at the core of what sacred means. So it's kind of an interesting introduction into a text that otherwise is very, very naturalistic. But I could see this being making reference to something that's in the broader cultural context, not necessarily something that's endorsed or perceived the same way within this Taoist way of looking at things, but kind of just trying to get across the idea that the world isn't something that you tweak with. And he continues to say, you cannot improve it. If you try to change it, you'll ruin it. And then if you try to hold on to it, you will lose it. So getting back to some of the stuff we were talking about, that there's a certain amount of hubris that comes into play with thinking that we could take something like, if we take it into modern terms, thinking about how evolution has developed this entire very intra-dependent ecosystem of how everything's are kind of in this balance, and that we could just walk in and say, oh, I know how to make this better, without having far-reaching ramifications that we might not even be able to conceive of. So this would be, very much along those lines is, why do you think you have, some way to come in here and start tweaking things, and you think that it's going to be for the better? You try messing with stuff and you're going to end up ruining it if you try to hold on to it. And I think here we could get into, the impermanence of things, this idea of trying to keep something the same without it evolving, without it changing, without there going through these different cycles. He's like, the tighter you try to hold on to keep something like that, it's just going to disappear altogether.
And yet it seems, Jim, to suggest incredible human power, because it's saying the human action can ruin or lose the universe. You would think that if it couldn't be touched, it wouldn't matter a rat's behind whether you tried to change it or hold on, it just would stay the same.
Well, it's kind of an interesting thing, because ultimately, like in terms of like what they refer to as the Tao, this idea of, the patterns of things, there's no messing with those. You can't undo them. You can't, the only thing you can do is attempt to try and go against them, but you won't be successful at doing it. So if we think about like, let's say a small scale ecological situation, all the laws that kind of govern it are still there. We can go in and start behaving in ways that are going to disrupt that balance, but it is ultimately going to balance itself out again. So you could think about one of the things that comes up frequently when thinking about climate or even just world issues today, about how much we've wiped out so much of these forests and these areas that were designed to really kind of take care of things like carbon dioxide in the air, that we've kind of wiped out. And it's going to create this imbalance that is ultimately has the potential for, let's say, making the earth uninhabitable for humans and maybe other animals as well. But then what's going to happen? It's going to just go right back to what it was doing. It's going to, you can interfere and cause chaos, not to the point where you're actually going to change anything, because the way the universe works, the world's going to continue working. It's going to just continue to unfold the way that it unfolds. We just might screw things up for what we're actually benefiting from. So in that scope of, let's say, the long-term history of the earth and how its climate has evolved in response to the different things happening on it, like life that has created more oxygen, which in a certain sense is actually very corrosive to other things. But it's created kind of this interesting balance between all these things through using these, inviolable forces that direct how things evolve naturally. We're kind of at that sweet spot that works for us. And, if we try to tweak that, we might end up making it no longer a sweet spot for something like us to exist. But
Jim, I heard an interesting kind of counterintuitive view expressed by Jamie Dimon. He's the head of Chase. He was saying that 100 years from now, climate change is not the issue. He says if we don't exist 100 years from now, it'll be because of nuclear proliferation. And, when you think of that threat, that's not just going to upset the balance for a period of time until it gets restored. I mean, that could be an almost irreparable change.
Well,
potentially.
Yeah. But again, it's going to depend on, the time frame that we're talking, right? So for us, absolutely. For other living things on the planet right now, absolutely. But in terms of how nature works. It didn't change how nature works. It's going to continue to do what it does. And the earth is either going to, I mean, at some point it's going to be enveloped by the sun and it's going to be destroyed, but the point is that the balance that has evolved that allows for life as we know it to exist, we can mess with that balance. We can't actually mess with the laws of nature in the sense of changing them, but we can interfere with the balance between things that can be very inappropriate or unhelpful for us. And that's the degree that I think they're talking about, the idea of ruining it. Not that we can actually ruin anything. We're just ruining a particular frame in which the balance of things is conducive to human life and other life, that we could mess with, but the overall process and how we got here and where it's going to go, we wouldn't actually be able to impact that.
I don't know. I mean, I think you could argue that nuclear power renders humans with almost godlike power.
Well, I mean, in what sense? Like, let's just say we totally destroyed the surface of the earth, which I don't know if that would be what we'd want to equate God. If we're going to have some kind of conception of God, I don't know if that's the one we want to have exactly. But
well, yeah, not a healthy God, but
yeah.
Nevertheless.
But let's say
power be. Let's say we'd be hitting over our heads. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. So let's say we wiped out the surface of the earth completely. That doesn't really change anything still, right? I mean, asteroids have smashed into the earth and totally like messed with the entire surface of the planet. But it keeps going in terms of those laws of nature. There's no stopping it. There's ways that things unfold within it, and technically our ability to actually create nuclear weapons is a direct result of us paying attention to those patterns and how do we work with them to create something like that. And even though it might seem kind of unnatural, it's actually there's no way to do anything unnatural. So the things that we create are all things that are perfectly natural for us to do. But the question is, what is our goal? And this would be the area where the Taoists are stepping in to say, we should be thinking about this in terms of how do we find this balance with this natural system? Because when we try to go against it or we try to improve it, we end up creating a mess of things. And maybe something like, the level of warfare and violence that happens within the human community is a result of, and this is, I think, where the Taoists would say, because we've kind of had these mental mind shifts that started to view things from more of this yang perspective instead of the yin perspective, of moving from this generative view of creation and how we participate into it, into this idea of something that needs to be controlled and protected, then we've moved into a mindset that has created this strife in a way that is not sustainable, that ultimately has that capacity, even though it's still through these natural processes, to actually ruin things. That's not helpful for us or other living things to pursue those ends, as opposed to trying to figure out how do we get into more of a balance and a harmony with those things.
I just view the nuclear thing as being different than anything asteroidal or otherwise that's happened before, where it happens and then you recover from it. But with half-lives and so forth, I mean, you basically, full nuclear wipeout would be, for as far as the eye could see. I mean, we don't even know how far it would extend. That's why I've always thought that in some sense, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were good things, because at least for rational actors, they got to see how great the damage could be, and that's probably why it's never happened since. But now we're dealing with non-rational actors where it's a distinct possibility.
Yeah, we definitely, the social systems that we have created have brought us to the point, if not already, and certainly there's lots of ways we could document this idea of ruining it throughout human history. We definitely have capacities to do ruining it on a scale even larger than what we've done in the past. But again, I think that just is kind of speaking to the point that this technology hasn't helped us to actually improve in some respects, but it's come with great costs of ruin or losing the very things that we were trying to achieve.
And I think of that book, Sapiens, where it basically argues that Homo sapiens have destroyed everything they touch. There's an element of truth to that.
Mm. Yeah, it's definitely, we have interesting capabilities with our self-awareness and the different mental models that we adopt in terms of how we engage and interact with our world have far-reaching implications. And this is probably where I'm most intrigued by this classical Taoist literature, is that it is really wrestling with that very idea that the worldviews, the way that we perceive the world, is going to have far-reaching ramifications. And I, again, am not claiming I have the answers for everything, or, do we just, and I'm not suggesting we give up on technology or we abandon the things that we have learned. And I don't think there's actually a way to go back, but I think that the way forward is going to have to involve more of these ways of looking at the world in terms of how do we move into more of a harmony with how the whole ecosystem, that supports life, how do we participate with that instead of thinking that somehow we can make it better? That's just, I think, kind of a general observation. It doesn't get into specifics on what does that look like, but we've seen a lot of what happens when we have the idea that we can make things better. And certainly there's things we can point to in terms of, advances that have been made in medicine, advances that have been made in terms of laws and social behavior. But a lot of those things are all things that had to get fixed because of a prior issue of how we started having such massive groups of people together. A lot of the diseases that we suffer from can only exist in large population groups that wouldn't be able to exist if we were still in kind of these smaller bands of people. But that has its own issues. But we have to kind of then get at the question, is the fact that lifespans for humans weren't as long actually a bad thing? We don't like the idea of, our own mortality, but if the balance of the life was that we were having maybe it was a shorter lifespan, but it was a healthier one, or one where we were much more in balance with everything, who's to say that that's necessarily wrong versus something where we've created a context where people can live a lot longer and maybe not suffer from the same kinds of diseases or have the technology to fix things like broken bones. But it comes with the cost that we've brought the world to the brink potentially of self-destruction. Was that movement from hunter-gatherer to advanced medical technology worth that cost? I don't know. It's interesting things to think about, though. And part of where he goes here then is he's going to list a number of kind of these yin-yang polarities. Again, not in terms of opposites and conflict, but just complementary opposites. Sometimes things are ahead, sometimes they're behind. Sometimes breathing is hard, somebody's working difficult, or sometimes it comes easy. There's times of rest. Sometimes there's strength and sometimes weakness. Sometimes one is up and sometimes down. Kind of makes me think, Rob, of Ecclesiastes, you know, time for everything.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, so you've got this, you know, there's ebb and flow, right? There's ways that things go, there's cycles, there's a natural rhythm to things. And how do we come to appreciate that for what it is? You know, it's hard to sometimes articulate the approach, because it sounds like if we're just trying to figure out how to appreciate the natural order of things and have that be enough, that somehow is putting like a damper on any type of creativity or novelty or exploration or whatnot. But I think it has to do with kind of like, what does that saying say? First seek to understand before seeking to be understood, or something like that.
Yeah, St. Francis of Assisi.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the approach that they're getting at here is, you know, before you start tweaking with things, understand what it is. You know, don't just have like this, again, this hubris that thinks that somehow I can just come in here and make everything better because I know better. When there's no way for us to know everything about anything. We need to really work to understand the nature of things before we think we can tweak them. And maybe that's just enough of the point that they're trying to make, that we need to adopt in thinking about our world from a modern day perspective. And then it concludes, says, therefore, the wise avoid extremes, excesses, and complacency. That complacency is interesting after what we were just talking about. And there's a couple of different ways that these three terms have been translated. I just want to bring in one other one that I found really interesting. And this is from Whaley. It says, therefore, the sage discards the absolute, the all-inclusive, and the extreme. And here I find a little bit more useful language, because when we get into the types of mindsets where we think we can make these kind of radical changes to the nature of reality, whether it's at that social level of trying to create, you know, a hierarchy in which we need humans to fit into kind of these predefined shapes, or we're talking about how we can, you know, control nature in various ways, or, you know, re-engineer things. Those all require a level of certainty about things that we don't actually possess. And here, I think, are some ways that that certainty is really challenged. This idea of absolute, the idea of all-inclusive, or the possibilities of these extremes. These are all related, I think, to that idea of certainty in terms of how we engage with the world. If we recognize that we can never know everything about anything, and we have more of that humility in terms of what our knowledge is, then it's much harder to work in terms of absolutes or all-inclusives or extremes, because we don't have that confidence. And I think that's maybe part of how we would approach this then at like that individual level, is trying to avoid those ways of thinking, absolute, all-inclusive, and extreme, in terms of how we move forward.
I think that is really instructive in our current environment, not only nationally, but almost on the world scene. It is like politics have reached the extremes. All you pretty much have now is an extreme right and an extreme left. Mm-hmm. Nothing that's moderate. And, you know, frankly, I think of my own son. You know, he lives in a in a radical bubble or silo where all he hears is similar views to his own. And he's absolutely persuaded that anybody who disagrees with him is either ignorant or malevolent. It's not possible in his worldview that anybody could be as educated and informed as he is and come to opposite conclusions. That's unthinkable in good conscience.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts at this, Taylor?
I don't think so. I think I'm still processing.
Yeah. This one, I think, definitely environmentalists prefer, or I shouldn't say prefer, but they tend to really appreciate something like this chapter because it really promotes a lot of the perspectives that come from that direction. But I think it's really informative on a lot of different fronts, whether we're talking about like more social arrangements or whether we're talking about how we deal with our environment or, even just our own personal thinking about who are we in this world. It really challenges a lot of the ideas where we tend to find somehow a lot of it's very comfortable for humans to think that they actually know more than they do and to act on it. And I'm not sure exactly where that comes from, but the fact that we can be aware that that's the case, really something like this helps us to put that a little bit in check. That before we just go marching off to do something because we're convinced we know and we have the truth, that it helps to put a little bit of a check there to say, well, don't be so quick to be so certain about that.
Yeah, I'm always leery of anybody who, says with absolute certainty, well, God has told me to do this. I think you have to view that with some skepticism.
Yeah, I mean, certainly religious perspectives can come into play with that. Excuse me, got a frog in my throat. But also, it can be political. It could be other types of ideologies. It's, and it can even just be in terms of like justice or legal approaches to things. We all have at different points of interaction in our world the ability to have a false sense of certainty that we know and that we are justified in our positions and that other people are not. And there is no way to really know that.
And we all have blind spots, and we're all subject to unintended, unforeseen consequences beyond the decision itself.
Exactly. Well, that's all I had for us today. If there wasn't any other items to discuss, we can go ahead and wrap things up. Are we good?
Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
Appreciate it, Jim. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you for joining today. And if you're watching this on video and you'd like to be a part of our live Zoom discussion or of our in-person meeting, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe. And we'd love to see you next time. Take care.